negotiate those terms. So that's what I was doing for 2 years, and then another year in the Netherlands, while I was doing my masters in advanced masters in law and digital technologies. While so that's the picture over there, if you can see it. That's actually an old observatory that Einstein used to teach in. And then on the right over there is a picture of me graduating. So in Leiden University, whenever you graduate, you have to go and sign your name in a room where everyone who has graduated from there in the past 500 years has signed their name. So it's called the sweat room, and that's what I'm doing there. Next slide, please. So from there, I moved on to the University of Malta. Could you please switch off these lights? Yeah. So that there on the left is the University of Malta, where I got one of my PhDs. On the right over there is Valletta, which is the capital of Malta. Have any of you heard of Malta? Yeah, you have. To those who haven't, it's basically an island in the Mediterranean, about 90 kilometers south of Italy. It's part of the European Union, and basically that's what their capital looks like. How many people do you think live in this country? 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, 50 lakhs? It's actually 5 lakh people who live in the entire country. And the country is the size of Mumbai. That capital, Valletta, has 8,000 people living in it. That's it. The capital of the country has 8,000 people living in it. Can you go to the next slide? So this is me graduating from the second university. That's the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. That's way up north. So if you can think of the mainland of Europe, it's just below Norway. That's me over there graduating. That's my PhD thesis, which is on identity management models and their impact on privacy and security. What that basically means is I was looking at identity cards like Aadhaar, etc., and trying to understand why in certain countries people are very accepting of giving away their personal information, while in others people don't like giving away their personal information based on culture, laws, technologies, things like that. Is that working now? The clicker? No. Can you go back a slide, please? So that's basically Malta. That's what a Mediterranean island looks like from all around. Just to show you some pictures, next slide. So Malta actually has this history of around 6,000 to 7,000 years, where some of the oldest structures known to man exist over there. They are called the megalithic temples. These are around 6,000 or 7,000 years old. Next slide. So that's what that looks like. And there are several of them spread across this island. So imagine an island the size of Mumbai with dozens of temples going back 6,000 to 7,000 years. And that's basically what that is. Next slide. So that's Valletta again. One of the best examples of what's called a Mediterranean style dome. So in a lot of Mediterranean countries like Italy, Greece, etc., they have this very specific kind of architecture which is made from stone. Malta is also known for having softer stone that's easier to work with. So they actually have walls around their fortifications that are 20 to 40 meters thick. So it literally takes you 20 to 40 steps to walk through a wall. I've been to something like 32 countries now and all around India, and I still haven't seen anything like it. So Malta is a pretty interesting place to work. Yeah, so next slide. So what is privacy? Let's go back to brass tacks, right? What at the very basic level is privacy? Have you guys thought of privacy before? Let's make this a bit interactive. So what do you think of privacy? What is privacy? You can raise your hand and give an answer. I mean, you're not lawyers, right? So let's just take a brief break. What are your backgrounds? For the rest of you, what are your backgrounds? Just BCom, commerce. Okay, how many of you are from commerce? Oh wow, most of you are from commerce. Okay, how many of you are lawyers? One lawyer. Okay, So I'm not expecting you to have these answers from a legal perspective, right? That's why I am here. So what do you think privacy is? Can anyone just raise their hands and just say what you think privacy means to you? Yes. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Hello.
Go ahead.
The privacy, I would say, any confidential matter which may be confidential to an individual or to an organization that can't be shared publicly
Yeah.
with various aspects to it.
Okay, so that's a good answer. Whatever something, if something is confidential,
Yes.
it's private.
Yeah.
Any other answers? So what do you think about the right, if you want as an individual to be left alone, do you think that's privacy? To be left alone? No. What if I say the right to control the information that you give to other people? Is that privacy? Yeah? What makes more sense? Control over what information you have or the right to be left alone? Control. So the interesting thing is both are actually definitions of privacy coming from different parts of the world. So the right to be left alone is a very American concept. As you can think, they're a highly individualist country. They want to have the right to be left alone if they choose to do so, right? And the European conception of privacy is the right to have control over how you share your information, your personal information, right? So both of them are actually definitions of privacy, but coming from different parts of the world. Next slide. So obviously, if you want to be left alone, one of the best ways to do that is just go move to a forest, right? Just go live alone in a forest. Isn't that one way to control information about yourself? No one knows who you are, no one knows where you are, no one knows what you're doing. So that's privacy, isn't it? But is it still privacy if there's no one else around to know who you are? What does it mean to be alone, so alone that basically you are not controlling your information at all, right? By the way, that's the Satpura Tiger Reserve, so I don't suggest you go and stay there. Next slide. Obviously, another way of maintaining privacy is to build walls around yourself, right? So this is obviously the Mumbai skyline. Instead of going into a forest, if you build walls around yourself, aren't you also therefore being private? Right? Whatever's within those four walls, you control who can see and who cannot, right? Who you're with, what you're doing, all that sort of stuff. As long as it's within those four walls, it's private, right? You can choose to have other people visit you, or you can choose not to. You can remove access to your privacy or not. Yeah. Next slide. So what exactly are you keeping private? Let's take by staying within those four walls. What are you controlling about yourself? Basically, it could be information about who you are, right? About what you're doing, who you are, where you live, what you do, what you know, who you know. All of these are things that you're trying to keep private, isn't it? So would you agree that these are examples of personal information? Yeah? Who you are, where you live. So what's that? Who you are, your name, is that personal information? Yeah? Your address, is that personal information? Your age, your gender, your family relationships maybe, your political viewpoint, is that personal information? Yeah? Your religion, is that personal information? It's all personal, right? Why is that? Because it identifies who you are as an individual. What other examples can you think of what's personal information? Just throw it out there. Your likes or dislikes on social media? Anywhere. So your likes and dislikes. So your opinions about things. Is that personal information? Does everyone agree? Anyone who disagrees? Okay, we'll discuss that a bit more. What else? What about your Aadhaar number? Is that personal information? Yeah? Your PAN card number? Bank account details? Usernames, passwords, are those personal information? Right? So there's a lot of things that can identify you as an individual, right? What about your fingerprints? Yeah, any biometric data, like your phone, does it have a face recognizing thing to unlock your phone? If it does, then is your face personal information? Everyone can see your face, but is it still personal information? Does it identify you as an individual? It does, right? So that's a basic understanding of what personal information is. Next slide. Let's do a practical exercise. Okay, we talked about putting yourself within 4 walls. What's the difference here though? So on the left, we have a filing cabinet with lots of documents in there. And on the right, we have a hard drive. What are the differences between these two pictures? About information about yourself, if it's on these things. Anyone? What's the difference between a filing cabinet and a hard drive? One's digital, right? One's physical. That's one difference. What else? Hard disk can be password protected. Can filing cabinets be password protected? You could put a physical lock on it, right? So in a hard drive, you put a password, you encrypt it, but a physical folder like that, you could just lock it, right? So that's another kind of difference. What else? What else? A physical file and a digital file. What are the differences? Accessibility. So you need to physically have access to a locker like that to get access to the files. But on the hard drive, you could access it as long as you have a hard drive anywhere, right? So a hard drive is obviously more portable than a filing cabinet, right? That's a big difference. What else? What about searching those files? What's easier to search? A filing cabinet or a hard drive? A hard drive is easier, right? What about sharing the information that's on there? What's easier to share? A hard drive, right? Because a physical file needs to be photocopied, maybe scanned or something. And once it's scanned, obviously it's on the hard drive. And then it becomes easier to scan, to send to people, right? Next slide. So let's look at these two differences. Anyone know what's on the right over there? They're servers, right? It's a server farm. What is that basically? It's just a bigger version of what's on the left, right? But what are other differences between these two things? What's the difference between you having a hard drive versus you storing data on the cloud, basically on a server farm? What's the difference? Okay, so the one running the server farm has access to that data. That's one thing. But if they don't have the hard drive, they don't have access to the data, right? What else? These are very basic differences that I'm looking for. Mm-hmm. The cloud is accessible to anyone who has the internet, right? But the hard drive, you have to physically have it with you to access it. So what's more accessible now, the hard drive or the server farm? The server farm is more accessible. What else? Keep in mind, do you need the internet to access one versus the other? Right? If you don't have the internet, you can't access the server farm, right? Almost no one is allowed physically to enter server farms. But if you have a hard drive with you, you don't have an internet connection. Let's say you are once again in the middle of a forest. What can you access? The hard drive or the server farm? The hard drive, right? It's easier to access the hard drive. What else? How many people can access the hard drive versus how many people can access the server farm? Is there a difference? Yeah, with the hard drive, one person can access it at a time, right? Whoever has the hard drive. But with the server farm, millions of people could access it, really, if they want to, right? Anything else? So let's keep it at that, all right? Next slide. Anyone know what that is, a map of? I mean, it says that over there. It's an undersea cable network, right? Owned by Google. Those are real physical cables going under the ocean that are connecting all the continents together, right? And all of these are owned by Google. in this case. So you can see that there are 3 of them connecting to India, and then several of them going to the US, even more going to Europe, right? You can see that, right? And what does that mean? It means that if any of these are connected to a server farm that I showed before, anyone from around the world can access those files, right? But with a hard drive, not everyone around the world can access it, just whoever has the hard drive with them. What's the difference between Google owning this versus what if the government owned these undersea cables? Is there a difference? Does it make a difference that a company owns this versus countries owning it? Right. So the government is a public entity while the company is a private entity. What difference does that make? Okay, so the point being made here is that with private companies can reject your access without any reason, while in the government entity, you can access it if you have a reason. Does that make sense to everyone? Anyone who thinks that that's not correct? So what if the police requests data from a company, from Google? Does Google have to share that data? They do, right? There is no way that that Google can stop the police from accessing some information in case of a criminal investigation or something, right? Now, if you try to access the Aadhaar database, can you do that? No, right? Unless you are an authorized person who has access to the Aadhaar database, you can't access the information on there, right? What about the income tax database? The income tax people probably have even more information on you than the Aadhaar database does, right? Can you access the income tax database? No, right? But if you ask Google to get your own data, can you do that? You can, right? So there are other differences here. One of the most important differences between Google owning this versus a government owning this is, have you guys heard of human rights? Can human rights be exercised against companies? Who thinks yes, you can exercise your human rights against companies? Just raise your hand. Who thinks you cannot exercise your human rights against a company? Can you exercise human rights against a government? Yeah, who thinks that? Who thinks you can exercise your human rights against governments? Just one person. Everyone else thinks you cannot exercise your human rights against governments, or you just don't care about answering. So, the biggest difference is human rights are essentially an agreement between you and the government. Okay? You can exercise your human rights if the government decides to restrict your freedom of speech or your freedom of livelihood. Then you can go to the courts and exercise your human rights against the government. But you can't do that against a company. Right? The human rights are written down in India in the Constitution. Companies don't have to follow the Constitution. They have to follow laws put in place under the Constitution. Does that make sense? Unless there is a law requiring Google to protect your data in some way, they don't have to. But the people in Aadhaar, the people in IT services, income tax, if now that you have the right to privacy, you can exercise that right against them. Okay, that's the biggest difference between a company and the government. Keep that in mind. Next slide. So just a brief summary of what law is. Okay, since we only have a single lawyer here, for the rest of you, this is a course that I take over 6 months, but we are just going to summarize it here. Next. So it's a set of rules. Everyone agree? Yeah, the law is a set of rules. Next. It's made by an authority. Yeah. A set of rules made by an authority. Does that make sense for what the law is? Next. It's enforceable. Do you get that? What that means? It means that if there is a law, you can actually do something with it. right? That's three things. What's the fourth is it regulates behavior. Does anyone disagree? Is this a good enough summary of what is the law? Yeah, it's a set of rules made by an authority. It has to be enforceable and it regulates behavior, right? These are the four basic ideas, the concepts behind what the law is. So, is it necessary for only the government to be the authority? Can anyone else make laws? What about this educational institution? It has rules in place for admissions, for your attendance, things like that, right? Is it an authority making a set of rules that's enforceable and changes your behavior? It is, right? It doesn't have to be the government that sets up laws. Anyone can set up laws, except then we call them rules, we call them regulations, right? But in the end, the concept is the same. And that's important for us to keep in mind because as I just showed you before, Google can and other private corporations control so much of where your data is going, right? So they can also set up their internal rules. Next. So some basic things to keep in mind. Different countries have different laws. Make sense? Right? India has different laws. The European Union has different laws. US has different laws. Pakistan, Bangladesh, they all have different laws. What else do they have different? They have different courts. Right? Everyone has their own judicial system. Make sense? And different times require different arguments. What that means is what is okay today may not have been okay 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And the other way around. What's not okay now may have been okay 100 years ago. Right? Can you think of examples of different times having different arguments? Yeah, what about same-sex marriage? It's not illegal now, but it was illegal even a few years ago, right? What about abortion rights? Yeah, abortion is a different argument now than it was 100 years ago, right? What about things like slavery? Obviously, 500 years ago, the argument was different from what it is today about slavery, right? Nobody actually wants slavery. So, different times means different arguments. And that's important to keep in mind because laws can stay on the books for decades, if not centuries, right? There are laws in India right now that are coming from the British era. But obviously, they don't make sense anymore when arguments have changed. Does that make sense? Next. This is just an overview of how different countries have different systems in place, right? You can see that basically every country has something different going on with it. In law, we know that there are basically two major systems of law. One is common law, which comes from the British. So everyone influenced by the British, you can see here, the US, Australia, right? The UK itself, obviously. And the other is everyone who was influenced by the Romans. So that's called civil law. And you can see everyone in blue here comes from the Roman understanding of law. What that basically means is in common law, judges can interpret the law, but in Roman law, judges cannot interpret the law. They are only there to enforce it. Okay, that's the basic difference. Next. So, talking about human rights, where do human rights come from? Because the right to privacy is a human right, right? So, it comes from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Anybody heard of this before? Who has heard of the UDHR? Feel free to respond. I am not going to berate you for it. I am not going to yell at you. Who has heard of the UDHR? No one's heard of the UDHR. That's great because I am here to tell you what it is. What about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? Yeah, not heard of it. Great. So, next slide. This is in 1948 when all of these governments got together to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why 1948? Because the Second World War just ended, right? So once they saw the Holocaust was happening, obviously they realized we must never have something like this happening again in the future. So these countries got together and said, you know what, we need to set a baseline of what it means to be human. And that is a declaration of human rights. But the problem with the UDHR is it's not enforceable. As I said, what's one of the 4 important things of the law? It has to be enforceable. Right? The UDHR was just a feel-good document telling you what people thought should be the basics of being a human being. Next slide. So this is what it said in relation to the right to privacy. Okay, Article 12. It says no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home, correspondence, etc. And one has the right to the protection of the law against such interference or attacks. Right? What's important to keep in mind here is the way lawyers work. This is not a universal right. This is not an absolute right. Why is that? Can anyone think of why this is not an absolute right? Mm-hmm. Right. So what is it in this sentence that makes it not absolute? When you read this, does it mean that it's an absolute right? Are you totally protected against any interference against your privacy, your family, home, or correspondence? Or is it possible for someone to interfere? Why is it possible? Because it's arbitrary, right? That's the way laws work. Every single word makes a difference, right? It says arbitrary interference, which means any interference that is not arbitrary is allowed, right? What's not arbitrary? The law is not arbitrary. So if you set up a law that infringes on your privacy in some way, the law is not arbitrary and the law is legal, right? It's allowed for that to happen. Next slide. So once people realize that, hey, you know what, the UDHR makes sense, but it's not enforceable, we want it to be enforceable around the world, they came up with the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, just 20 years after that. And this is enforceable. So anyone who has signed this international treaty needs to have all of the rights that are in the ICCPR actually enforceable in their own country. Okay, the language here is exactly the same, it's just Article 17 this time instead of Article 12. Next slide. So these are all the parties and signatories to the ICCPR, right? It's basically almost everyone. Who is it not? Who has not signed the ICCPR? China. It did sign it, but then it got itself out of the ICCPR. That's why the different color. What else? Saudi Arabia, Myanmar, North Korea, right? So can you see the basic difference between countries that signed the ICCPR and the ones that didn't? Yeah, it's easy to see, right? What sort of country you have to be to not sign the ICCPR. Everyone else has signed it, regardless of whether they are dictatorships or democracies. They've still signed it, which means that on paper you do have those human rights available to you, right? So what is the right to privacy in India then? Because it is, as I said, one of the rights under the ICCPR, right? So it is in, next slide, Article 21 of the Constitution of India, right? What basically happened was in 2017, there was the Puttaswamy judgment. Anybody heard of that? The Puttaswamy judgment? So what basically happened was the Supreme Court, as I said, we are a common law country, right? Which means that the judges can interpret the law. So what happened here was the Supreme Court judges read the right to privacy into the Constitution of India. So the Constitution of India doesn't have the word privacy anywhere. But what the judges said was that when it comes to the protection of life and personal liberty under Article 21, this includes within it your right to privacy. Okay? Life and personal liberty includes privacy. That's what they've said. And this was only in 2017. So when I said different times, different arguments, does that make sense now? Not just 50 years or 100 years, just 5 years ago, Indians got the right to privacy. Before that, we did not have it. Okay? Next slide. So between 2017 and 2022, what's basically happened is several bills have been created to implement the right to privacy for your information. Okay? So data protection bills, there was one in 2018, and then people said there are things wrong with it. So the government decided to release a second bill, which was in 2019, and then people said there are lots of things wrong with it. And now in November of 2022, that's when the last bill came about. 2 months ago. Okay, that's when the bill came about. Do you know the difference between a bill and an act? Yeah, what's the difference? So the bill has to be passed before it becomes the law, right? Until it's a bill, for as long as it's a bill, it's not the law. It means nothing, really. right? It's only once it goes into the law books, once it's promulgated, that you can actually depend on that as the law. Okay, that's the difference. So right now, this is just a bill. That means all of your rights to privacy are theoretical, conceptual at best. You don't really have them. Next slide. So how does this law, this bill, define privacy and personal data? The reason why I'm trying to go into it is because regardless of what happens, even if this bill is not passed into law, something similar will be passed, because that's just where the world is going. Okay, so it's important to keep the basic concepts in mind. So what is personal data? It means any data about an individual who is identifiable by or in relation to such data. So everything that we discussed, your name, your address, even your Aadhaar card, your political opinions, all of those are covered by this definition, right? Personal data, because it identifies you, right, in relation to it or by that information itself. The other three terms are actually just the parties involved. So if it's you whose personal data is being collected, you are the data principal. Okay? If I am the one collecting your data, I am the data fiduciary. All right? Now, for example, if I am the owner of a website, okay? Let's say I am the owner of Flipkart, okay? So I am collecting your information, your address to deliver goods to you, right? So in that case, you are the data principal. I, as Flipkart, am the data fiduciary. Now, obviously, I am not interested in running the website on my own. So I give someone else the authority to run the website. In that case, whoever is running the website for me is the data processor. Okay? So you are the data principal, I am the data fiduciary. So whoever is running my website is the data processor. Make sense? Yeah, those are the basic parties involved. And what are they doing? They are processing personal data. Your personal data, I am processing through someone else. Okay, so there are three parties that are possible in this transaction. Next slide. So me, as the data fiduciary, what obligations would I have? The first is to process only for a lawful purpose. Okay, in the Indian bill, it's very simple. It just says anything that's not unlawful, you can do. That's all it says. In European law, in US law, there are very specific purposes for which you can process personal data. But in India, it's pretty simple at this point. What do I have to do if I'm processing your data? The first thing I would have to do, if this bill is passed into law, is give you notice that I'm going to collect your data and why I'm collecting your data and what I'm going to do with it. Okay? Does that make sense? I have to tell you that I'm going to collect your data before collecting it. And then I can only collect it if I get your consent to collect that data. That's the second thing. Okay? First is providing notice. Second is getting your consent. Free and full informed consent. Can you think of examples where someone is giving you information to get your consent to process personal data on the internet? Cookies. Has anyone seen the cookie banner? You have to give your consent. Why are they doing that? Next slide. Something like this, right? With Google and other websites. Why are they doing this? They are giving you notice, you see. They are giving you notice of what data they are collecting from you, and then they are getting your consent to get your data from you. Why are they doing this? Because as I said, even if this bill doesn't pass, something similar will pass, because that's where the world is going, because this is what EU law requires, European Union law. It requires notice to be given, consent to be had, and free and informed. Okay? What you can't see below is you can say either I agree or customize. And these days it actually says I agree and I disagree. What does that mean? Because one of the basic ideas of consent is that you should be able to withdraw it or not give consent. Okay? If it is harder for you to not give consent than it is to give consent, what sense does it make? Right? It's not equal. So until a few years ago, it was actually more difficult to not give consent than it was to give consent. And then there was a judgment that came about in the European Union that said, wait, this doesn't make sense. You have to give I agree or I disagree, both buttons together, not I agree and customize. Okay? So that's how that works. So the law is constantly changing. The way the law is written, the way it's interpreted, it all keeps changing, right? And that's what's happening in this case. Next. So what are some other obligations on me as the data fiduciary? What would I have to do? I would have to ensure that your data is accurate. Okay, that's something that's on me. You don't have to tell me to have for your data to be accurate. I should have that responsibility. The second is to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. What does that mean? It means that you have to put in whatever it takes to keep data secure. Okay? So that could mean having people in charge of keeping the server secure, or it could mean having a firewall, right? Or it could mean having username password systems in place, things like that. Technical and organizational measures. You have to take reasonable security safeguards to keep your data secure. So in the case of a server farm, for example, you could have a username password to access the server farm, but you also need to lock the door to the servers, right? So reasonable security measures. In case of a data breach, you have to give notice to the people whose data got breached. Every single person whose data got breached, you have to tell them. If the law is not in place to tell you, would anyone do it? If you as a company got breached, would you want to tell people that you got breached? No, right? That's why you need the law, to tell people that yes, you have to tell others if you got breached. You also have to delete data that is no longer necessary. So what does that mean? If you delete your Facebook account, you delete your Instagram account, can they keep your data? Under Indian law now, yes, they can. But under this bill, they have to delete it because it's no longer necessary. You deleted your account, right? What can they do with it? Okay? You have to provide contact details of a data protection officer. So this is important just from a practical standpoint, because if this bill becomes the law, there are going to be tens of thousands, if not more, job openings in India for data protection officers. Okay? Everyone who is considered a significant data fiduciary has to employ data protection officers who will then be that contact point. If you have problems with the way your data is being processed, you should have someone to contact, right? That's the DPO, the data protection officer. And then once you contact them, they have to have some sort of redressal mechanism, okay, to make sure that whatever has gone wrong is righted. You get your justice. Okay, so that's something the law also requires, to have a redressal mechanism. Next. So, what is I just mentioned significant data fiduciary, right? What's a significant data fiduciary? Basically, anyone that the central government says is a significant data fiduciary. Why would they say that you're a significant data fiduciary? Because of maybe the volume of data you're processing. So can you think of what a significant data fiduciary could be based on volume? Facebook, WhatsApp. What else? They're both owned by Meta, by the way. What apart from Meta? Google, is that a significant data fiduciary? Yeah. What else? Flipkart I just mentioned. What about Amazon? Yeah, is that a significant data fiduciary? What other examples? It also talks about not just volume, but also sensitivity of the personal data being processed. So who processes sensitive personal information of yours? Can someone repeat that? UPI applications. Yeah, is that sensitive? They could most likely be significant, right? What about hospitals? Are they processing sensitive personal information? Yeah, so a hospital could be considered significant, right? What else? Banks, because they are processing a lot of data, right? Volume and sensitivity. What else? There are lots of examples out there, right, of people who are processing significant amounts of data. Passport officers, right? Anyone who issues identity cards would be a significant data fiduciary, right? So apart from that, it's also about the risk of harm. If there's a high risk of harm, they might be put up as significant. Potential impact on the sovereignty and integrity of India. So what about defense forces? They could be, right? Or in import and export, if you are importing something that is dangerous. to India or exporting something that you should not be exporting, you could become a significant data fiduciary, right? Because it harms the sovereignty and integrity of India. Risk to electoral democracy. So what about companies that engage in changing your opinions about political parties? Would they be significant data fiduciaries? They could be, right? The central government could notify that they are, because it's a risk to electoral democracy. The security of the state, public order, and this is something lawyers do to keep it open-ended. Such other factors as it may consider necessary. Anyone could be a significant data fiduciary if the government gives enough of a reason for it, right? Now, anyone who has large sets of data is basically a significant data fiduciary. And if you are an SBF, next slide, you have some obligations, right? One of those I told you, you have to hire a DPO. You have to have an independent audit of your processes, your technical and organizational measures. You have to take data protection impact assessments of what you're doing to ensure that if there is a high risk, you actually try to mitigate that risk in some way. All right, next slide. So talking about large sets of data, I am assuming everyone here has heard of big data, right? What is big data? It's just a large volume of data, isn't it? So why is it necessary now? Next slide. It's because of three things. One, data sets. Large data sets exist, right? Second is algorithms for actually parsing those. And the third is computing power. So we've had large data sets for centuries, if not millennia, all right? But we have not had the algorithms to parse them for more than a couple of centuries. Just mathematicians working out how to work with data. But the computing power to actually do something with that data set, to do something with those algorithms, we've only had for a couple of decades, right? So that's why big data is important now, because these three things exist together. Next slide. Also because computing power has been getting cheaper and cheaper, right? And it's going to keep getting cheaper and cheaper, which means that the sort of things you can do with data now pale in comparison to what you can do with them probably in the next 10 years. Okay, next slide. Anybody heard of the Cambridge Analytica scandal? Yeah? Are there people who haven't heard about the Cambridge Analytica scandal? You can raise your hands because I'm going to tell you what it is. All right, so that's great. So the Cambridge Analytica scandal, next slide, was basically about a political consulting firm in the UK. They were a subsidiary of SCL Group, which called itself a global election management company. And what they did, what they are is a private intelligence company that had close ties to British political leaders, royal family members, and the military in the UK. Okay, next slide. So what they actually did was they collected data on up to 50 million people, and this, you can go and read this set of articles that talks about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. That's the guy, I don't know if you can see the picture, who was whistleblowing it. Next slide. So what did they do? There's the company, Cambridge Analytica Limited, they hired someone, a Cambridge University professor, to create a personality test that would be shared on Facebook. Okay? So anyone who takes that personality test, they would be paid some amount of money to give that personality test, and the data was being collected for what they said was academic research purposes. But what actually happened was that they collected data on you if you gave the personality test, but then they also got your friends list on Facebook. So only 2 to 3 lakh people actually gave the personality test, but because you now had access to their friends list, they got up to 5 crore, right? 50 million. That's how they did that. So did they get consent of everyone who was on the friends list? No, right? They only got consent from 2 to 3 lakh people, and they did that. So next slide. What they did with that information was they used it for micro-targeting of political advertising. Okay, so they said, if you are a political party and I am Cambridge Analytica, I will say I will sell you my services to target specific people based on how they feel about certain issues. And then by targeting them, change their opinions or confirm their opinion about whatever it is. Okay, next slide. This is the guy who was the CEO of the the CEO of this company, and he said that he has up to 4 to 5,000 data points on every individual, every adult in the US. That means 230 million people. And what they were doing with it was to look at people who were, now this is in the US obviously, so they care about stuff like abortion, gun rights, things like that, okay? And what they did with it, what they're accused of doing is messing with the 2016 US elections. So there are people who say that it's Cambridge Analytica that was instrumental in getting Trump elected. So that's what they were doing with data that they collected from personality tests on Facebook. So you can see how much of an impact this has, right? Next slide. So what is data? When they say they have 4 to 5,000 data points, what's data really though? Because this is how it's defined in the law, all right? And it's a very basic definition. It's just a representation of information, facts, concepts, opinions, instructions, etc., right? It's just data. So what's a data point? It's a unit of that data. So can you think of what a data point is on Facebook? It's easy enough, right? Your name, your posts, your likes, your reactions to posts, your shares, your comments, right? All of this information that you are willingly giving out in the public. That's the data points that they were collecting. And you can imagine how there could be 4 to 5,000 of those, right? Likes, shares, I mean, so many of those everyone does every day, right? Next slide. What were they doing with it? They were running an algorithm on it to create a profile on you. Okay, what's an algorithm? It's just a basic set of steps. That's all an algorithm means. Okay, we've all done mathematics, right? We know what BODMAS is. Brackets, orders, division, multiplication, addition, subtraction. What is that? It's a series of steps that you have to follow in order to reach a conclusion. It's an algorithm. Okay, it's as simple as that. So they got all those data points and then they used their algorithms to create a profile to know who and what sort of person you are, what you like, what you dislike. Okay, next slide. How did they gather this data? They got it through something called an API. Anyone know what an API is? No. So an API is just like a gateway, okay? So if I am Facebook and you want to access my data, I will give you a gateway to access that information. That gateway is the API, okay? You connect to that gateway to get my information. So they had something called the Graph API before, and this is before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where they were giving away loads of information to people, right? Why did they do this? They just wanted it to work, right? That's how tech giants work. They just want stuff to work. They want to hack it until it works. But obviously this created problems, right? They got fined millions of euros, millions of pounds because of this scandal. So once they got fined, they learned better and, next slide, they changed it. So they now made that gateway more restrictive. So you have to have a specific reason for getting access to that data, right? So now it's actually one of the better examples of thoughtful access to third parties of Facebook's information. Next slide. So this is basically what they did, right? Once Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, they started restricting data access and protecting people's information on Facebook. And then they got so restrictive that, next slide, researchers started talking about how it's a disaster, right? Because if you're an academic researcher, you want access to Facebook's data, you should be able to access it, right? It's just academic research. Now, if they cut it off completely, it's a problem, right? So then they had that conversation, and then over the next few years, next slide, they announced a researcher API, which means they announced a separate gateway for you to get access if you're an academic researcher. They would then vet you to see you if you're actually a researcher, and then give you access, right? So this keeps on going back and forth. Next slide, the one after. Next. So let's talk about some of the challenges of data processing, all right? We talked about privacy until now. We talked about big data, why large sets of information, how they can be used, how they can be misused, right? So what are some of the challenges of processing large amounts of personal information? Let's talk about that. Next. One of them is a security challenge of just misuse of data, right? Human error. It doesn't even have to be malicious. If you work in a company, you've been given a password to access their systems, you write down that password because you can't remember it and then stick it on your screen. you didn't want to maliciously do something about it, but it was just an error. Anyone else could see that password and access that information, right? What else? If you just left the company, but then the company didn't remove your access, you could still go back to that system and then do something with their data, right? That's malicious, obviously, but it's still an internal error. So that's what that news article is about. It says 94% of organizations actually experienced insider data breaches. Just people leaving their passwords out there, people using very simple passwords. You use 1, 2, 3, 4, ABCD. Everybody, anyone can guess that, let alone computers, right? Or if you actually maliciously hack data while being an insider employee, that's what happens usually. Next. Another one is whistleblowing. Anybody heard of Julian Assange? Yeah? So Julian Assange is a journalist who is currently in jail in the UK because what he did was he set up a website where anyone who thinks that a company or a government is doing something unethical, they can get that data and put it on his website. So that's what he did. It's called WikiLeaks. Yeah? So there were people who if I think that the government is doing something wrong and I am a government employee, I could go to a journalist and tell them, hey, look, the government is doing something wrong. Okay? But if I am an idiot about how I'm sharing that information, what if I am, for example, an income tax officer who thinks that the data is being misused? And then I share the income tax database with the journalist, and the journalist puts it up online. Obviously, what I'm doing, I think is right, but I could jeopardize millions and millions of people's data, right? By giving it to a journalist who then puts it up online. You have to be thoughtful about how you do this. So this is one of the risks of data. Next. Cyber attacks, obviously, and these are just some of the big ones every month in the last year, in 2022. Cyber attacks happen all the time, and there is simply no way to make a system unhackable, right? All you can do is minimize the damage. And here you can see, it just keeps happening. You can't stop it. Next. You can have what's called fake data and data poisoning. So what's fake data? For example, you want to just set up an account somewhere. Do you have to give them your real name? You don't have to, right? You don't have to give them your real details if it's just setting up an account somewhere. You're just giving them fake data, right? What about data poisoning? So let's say you go to a restaurant. In restaurants, after you eat, some of them give you a form to fill, right? To say, was the food good? Was the service good? Things like that. Now, if you don't care about it, you could just say everything was bad, right? Or you could say everything was good. So can the restaurant use that data anymore? No, because why? Their data got poisoned because you didn't care. You filled in something however you wanted to. Now, how can they rely on that data, right? That's called data poisoning, when the data itself is unreliable. Next. Obviously, it also brings up ethical issues, right? When you collect huge amounts of data. Have you guys heard of George Orwell's 1984? No? So it's basically just a look at how authoritarian governments can have an inside look at everyone who is a citizen of that government, okay? Mass surveillance, where everyone has CCTV, or the government has CCTV cameras everywhere. They're looking at every action that you are taking. They know exactly who you're meeting, they know exactly what opinions you have, and then based on those opinions, they could put you in jail. So China does this all the time, right? They have such a tight grip on their internet. It's actually called the Great Firewall of China, where they don't allow any outside data into China unless the government approves of it, unless the information is definitely not anti their government, right? Anti the Communist Party of China. So that's how bad it can get. And why is that? Because when you collect data online, you can do anything with it, right? If you have the power to do so. So obviously surveillance on all fronts is a huge risk when you are giving away your data. Next. One thing to keep in mind, as long as you have a phone, right? Everyone has a phone here, right? You're accessing websites, you have apps in there, your phone contains so many measuring devices, right? Accelerometers, it has a GPS, it knows exactly where you're going, at what speed. It has microphone in it that sometimes might be on even if you don't know that it's on, right? Alexa was known for doing this. Google is still known for doing this. They keep their microphone on in the background, and therefore you might have noticed sometimes when you're talking to a friend about something, let's say buying a house, and suddenly you start seeing advertisements about houses, right? So even your phone company, for example, could sell your information because you have that phone number, right? Geo or Airtel or whatever. You get sometimes you get cold calls on your phone, right? You get messages of advertisers on your phone. Why do you get that? It's because phone companies are selling your data, right? Because now they have a profile on you. They can sell this to advertising companies, and then those advertising companies can micro-target you for advertising, right? All because of a digital DNA, right? That's what it's called. Next. Anybody know who that is? Edward Snowden, right? Snowden's revelations. What did he reveal? What was he doing? He was a whistleblower. Do you know what he was whistleblowing? CIA, someone mentioned. So basically, American intelligence services, CIA, NSA, were collecting data on the internet for everyone who was accessing the internet, basically. Okay, you saw that the undersea cable network, right? Most of the data centers were actually in the US. So any data that passed through their data center, the NSA is collecting. Okay, not was, is collecting. Now, what the Americans were concerned about was the fact that they were collecting data on Americans. They were not concerned about the fact that they were also collecting data on non-Americans, right? All of us. They don't care about that, but they are doing that. Every single non-American's information that passes through the US, which is all of us, you can't stop information from going anywhere, right? So if it's going to the US, the NSA knows who you are, essentially. Right? That's what he revealed, that this is the level of surveillance that is going on in the US right now. Okay? And what was the consequence of this? Basically, better data protection laws were passed in the US, better data protection laws were passed in the EU, and no data protection laws have been passed in India. So they are still doing this clandestinely, not just clandestinely, they're doing it openly, right? And the Indian government has done nothing about it. Until now, it's still a bill. Next. One thing to keep in mind is this idea of anonymization, okay? So what is anonymization? Let's say, for example, victims of crimes, okay? A journalist reporting on a victim tries to put a fake name of the victim, right, in their article. But if they put enough information in that article, you can actually figure out who that victim was. Right? So what are they doing? You can re-identify that anonymized, that pseudonymized individual just because you made the connections together, right? So what is anonymous information, for example? It's called, for example, aggregated information is anonymous, right? So if I say everyone who is present in this auditorium, is that aggregated? Is that personal data, everyone who is in this auditorium? It's not. You can't identify individuals, right? But what if I say everyone on this side of this auditorium? Is that personal data? It still isn't, right? But now if I say everyone in this second row of this side of this auditorium at this time, now I have given you enough information to actually narrow down the possibilities to 4 people, right? So now you know who was there. So what does that mean? I started with aggregated, anonymized information, and then I kept adding information until now I know who it is. Right? So that's what that article is saying. That it is so easy with big data analytics because you have large data sets, you have great algorithms, and you have the computing power to do it. If there are large enough data sets, you can re-identify everyone who's in there. Right? It says 99% of the 99.98% of the people in anonymized databases could be re-identified. Do you see how much of a problem that is? Right? Next slide. So there's also this problem of discrimination and bias that happens because data is not kept private. Okay? Because you can be profiled using algorithms that are using so much computing power. One of those examples is this COMPASS system, the Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions system. What was it? It was basically, so in the United States, when a judge has to decide how long a sentence to give you, okay, because usually in the law it says 6 months to 5 years, okay, a sentence. It's up to the judge to give you a shorter or a longer sentence. And they do that on the basis of this idea called the recidivism rate. What that means is, once you are out of jail, what's the likelihood that you will commit a crime again? Okay? So if you have a high likelihood of committing a crime, you have a high recidivism rate. Low chances of committing a crime, you have low recidivism rate. Okay? Now, there was an algorithm that they gave to judges in the US to automatically figure out what a particular person's recidivism rate was. All right? And based on what that algorithm, automated system, told the judge, that's how long a sentence he would give. Now, the problem with this system was that it had a racial bias. So, next slide. You should read this website if you can. What it basically showed was that white people in the US were always consistently given low recidivism rates compared to non-white people. Okay? So if any of us turned up before a judge in the US, that system, the COMPASS system, would give us a high recidivism rate because we are not white. And therefore the judge would give us a higher sentence because of racial bias, right? So why was that? Because maybe consciously or subconsciously, whoever designed that system, they allowed their own bias to get into the algorithm. Okay? So if I design an algorithm and if I have some sort of bias in my mind, naturally the way I design that algorithm, the way I design those steps will reflect the bias that I have. Okay? And now if I have a system that is created today and this system is implemented like they did it, it could be used for decades. Right? And every single person who was influenced because of this algorithm would be mistreated because of the algorithm. And why is that happening? Because personal data was used, big data sets were used through algorithms using computing power. Right? In a lot of these cases, those algorithms, these days they call them machine learning, right? Artificial intelligence. They use these sorts of statistical, mathematical processes that are actually impossible for you to even know what they're doing, right? How they reach those conclusions. They're called black boxes. So it's basically a black box that's determining your future. Can you think of an example of an automated system that could define your future? Now, what about credit rating? Yeah, when you go for a loan, the bank has to decide whether you can repay the loan or not, right? And for that, they give you a credit rating. The credit rating is done automatically. There isn't a human being who is doing that. So it's an automated system that could be biased against you, right? You never know. Based on your age, based on where you're from, based on how much money you make, based on hundreds of factors, because as we can see, people have thousands of data points on every individual, right? Based on even your social media comments, maybe it could take that into account and then decide whether or not to give you a loan, right? So these are automated systems that could influence, define your life. Next slide. This is a book I recommend all of you to read if you can. It's called Weapons of Math Destruction. And what it basically talks about is all of these systems, and you would be surprised how many systems around you are defining how you live your life. Okay, defining who you are, defining major decisions in your life, just because of automated systems. Next slide. So some final thoughts. As I spoke about, the bill that is in place right now is still just a bill. It's not a law. Right now we have something called the Information Telecommunications Act, the IT Act 2000, and there are some rules associated with it, but they don't contain any of the obligations that I talked about here. Nothing about informed consent, nothing about notice, right? Nothing about deleting data, about having redressal mechanisms, nothing. But soon enough, we might have those safeguards, right? If not the next 2 years, maybe the next 5 years, but it's going to happen, most likely in this decade, right? Hopefully. Because if that doesn't happen, then basically your right to privacy is only going to be against the government. As I said, the human rights can only be exercised against governments. Yeah, but Facebook, newspaper websites, right? News websites, they're all private corporations. You can't go and exercise your human rights against them. Another thing to keep in mind, whenever an individual can be identified in any data that you collect in your future work, if you see that you're going to create databases on people, you're going to have clients, for example, if you get into independent consulting, any information that you have on your clients that identifies individuals will make you obligated to keep it private, to keep it confidential. And if the new law comes about, all of those obligations that I said that apply to data fiduciaries will apply to you. Yeah? So even if you don't know exactly how to handle those obligations, now you know that you do have those obligations, right? You now know that you have to consult an expert or your in-house lawyer or someone to tell him or her that I have these obligations, tell me how to meet them. Yeah? And finally, whenever personal data processing results in profiling, what I talked about, automated profiling, you will have even more obligations. So in the EU, as of this point, whenever an automated profile is created on you and a decision needs to be made on that, the law requires human intervention. Okay, so a human being needs to make sure that any decision that's made on you through an automated system is vetted to make sure that it's right. Okay, in India also we could have this in the future and other obligations. So that's basically it from my end about data protection and privacy. Thank you, and let me know if you have any questions. No questions? Everyone understood what privacy means and what data protection means? At least a surface level understanding would also be good enough, right? We only have an hour here. This usually is taught in full courses, entire degrees, like I did my master's degree in this, right? Law and digital technologies. So, but just enough for you to understand that these obligations exist, especially to understand that your private information has value to other companies, and you should see whether or not to share that information with companies. Okay, when you get the option to give consent or to not give consent, think about it. Don't just click OK. Yeah, if that's the only thing that you take away from here, I have succeeded. Yes, question.
So how do you suggest where in many times there is no option of not selecting a cookie or something that sort? How do we protect ourselves from data theft or data privacy? I mean, we don't have that option many a times.
Usually you would have the option just because the law requires them to have that option, but it'd be hidden, right? It wouldn't be on the surface. It wouldn't say, I agree, I disagree. As I showed you in the Google option, it would say, I agree, and then customize. So in the customization options, you would see that you can say yes, no to, and they want to make it as difficult for you to give, not give your consent as possible. So you would have to press it like 5 times, 10 times, right? Instead of saying reject all, you would have to go and reject every single one individually. There's nothing that you can do about it. So keep in mind, informed consent is not something that companies need to do to you right now anyway. It's just a bill, as I said, it's not the law. The fact of the matter is you are being shown that banner because the company could not be bothered to spend the money to not show you that banner. Because they decided, you know what, they have to show it in Europe, so let's just show it everywhere. Why maintain different versions of websites where banners don't need to be shown? Because keep in mind, in India, the banner does not need to be shown. Your rejection of that consent, you saying no, means nothing under Indian law. Okay? Hopefully, in 2 or 3 years, when the new bill is passed, your rejection will mean something. But right now, what you're basically depending on is companies trying to show you that they care about your data. So it really depends on companies trying to protect their own reputation, not really about the government compelling them to protect your data. So right now, it's only about basic consent, not about informed consent. They can tell you anything and get your consent if they have to. Now keep in mind, financial regulators have different laws also. SEBI, RBI, they all have different, some basic requirements when it comes to financial regulation. But that's too complicated to talk about now. But just keep that in mind. I hope that answers your question. Anything else? There's a question back there.
Sir, when we talk about data privacy, don't we have provision in IT Act 2000?
That's exactly what I said. The Information Telecommunications Act, the IT Act 2000, has some provisions. But as I said, it doesn't have any of the obligations that I talked about before. To give you notice, to get your consent, to delete data once it's no longer necessary. None of that exists. It's only a very basic requirement for companies to keep your data private. That's it. Not about how they are collecting it, how they are using it, nothing about that.
So then recent this scandal was there about the Sushant Singh Rajput's case, where there was a celebrity, Deepika Padukone, was under the investigation for the usage of drugs, and that WhatsApp chat was which came out.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we say that the data is secured on WhatsApp side then?
So that's the thing about companies having to meet their legal obligations. In criminal law, if you put out a warrant for certain information, if the police puts out a warrant, companies cannot say no. So if, for example, in Facebook you have public information and private information, right? So if some crime is committed and the police ask Facebook to disclose all the private information, Facebook has to do it. If you read their terms and conditions, it says that we will not disclose your information unless it's to comply with our legal obligations. One of those is responding to requests, warrants to give information. When it comes to WhatsApp, the only thing that protects you is the technical encryption, right? It's called end-to-end encryption. So basically, only the two phones of the two people chatting should have access to the unencrypted chats. And anything in between them, you can't access. Now, if the police asks for your phone, then where's the encryption, right? So now anyone who has your phone can read your WhatsApp texts, right? So even that doesn't really work. I hope that answers your question.
So one more question.
Yeah.
Sir, you might know the app called Pegasus, which is developed by the Israelis. So what you can say about that?
So again, when it comes to data collection, there are two kinds of data collection. Okay, there's open source data collection and covert data collection. The Pegasus application does both. So when it comes to open source data collection, what that basically means is any information you put out in public yourself can be collected by anyone, right? So what Pegasus and other systems are doing is they simply collect all this open source data that you've put out there, right? Your Instagram profile, all your social media accounts that are out there in public, anything you write in comments, on Reddit, etc. All of that is public. They just collect it, right? And the covert means of data collection is where they hack into your mobile phone, into your accounts to gather that data. Obviously, that's illegal, right? When covert data collection is done, again, by an intelligence agency that is not of your country, it's illegal. But it could also be legal. So if the Indian Intelligence Service is given the mandate to covertly collect data by the government, they could do it, right? Because it's not arbitrary. The law requires them to do that. So, it's the number of protections that happen against intelligence services are very different from the kind that happen against private entities. That's also another difference between the government and private corporations. So India does not have any oversight mechanism over intelligence services and what data they collect. Nobody to ask questions to them about what data you're collecting. In the EU, in the UK, in the US, they have intelligence oversight. Okay, that's part of the work that I've been doing with my department is talking about intelligence oversight. India doesn't have any. Again, one of those examples of where you might think you're protected, but you aren't, unfortunately. Any other questions?
Thank you, sir.
There's a question there. There's over there.
Anonymization services which offer they can create, if you take Reddit as a client, where various applications offer anonymous browsing of that application. So if that anonymization can be re-identified by any of the data processors, so how I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. So talking about anonymization services on the internet, right? So like Tor, right, the onion router, or VPNs, virtual private networks. What they are basically doing is they are building walls around your internet traffic, okay? From your system to whatever you are accessing, it builds walls around them. Anyone who is inside those walls can see what traffic is being done. So the website that you access using a VPN knows that you are accessing it. Okay, and if you put in your username password there, the website obviously knows. But anyone outside those walls does not know who you are and what you're doing. The way that they maintain anonymization with VPNs is they just don't keep your data, right? That's what they say. They will not keep any of the logs of what websites you're accessing, how long you're accessing, etc. Because if they keep those logs, the police can ask for it.
And they still do. So like, have you basically heard of the NordVPN data leak?
Yes. Yeah.
If their main policy is not having that data to be collected, so but why are they still collecting it?
There are some kinds of data that the law requires them to collect. Okay, so in the US, for example, there are requirements, obligations on VPNs to collect data on you. There are other countries where there is no requirement. So there are other VPNs like Malvad VPN, which is based in Sweden, I think. There are no obligations in that country for VPNs to collect traffic data. So there are some VPNs that don't collect any data and are not obligated to collect any data. And then there are some VPNs that say they don't collect any data, but the law requires them to. So you have to look at what VPN you are getting. Okay, because again, as long as anyone has access to those logs, they know who you are.
And just to be how are to be well informed about these data.
So there are several resources on the internet where you can look at where data breaches are happening, what sort of VPN is good to have. Look at Reddit. There are lots of resources where you can look at those things. But it's up to you. One of the basic things that I'm trying to tell you is that the protection of privacy, your protection of your own privacy is also your own responsibility. If you give consent to your data collection, then nothing is stopping anyone from doing what they said they will do with your data, right? If you just click yes blindly to something, you did this to yourself, right? So you have to keep in mind that you don't give consent. When it comes to VPNs, for example, or any of these other tools that maintain anonymity, it's your responsibility to ensure that you're using good VPNs. The onion router, for example, Tor, is actually financed by DARPA, which is the US Defense Agency. So if you know that, and you know that the US Defense could probably get whatever is going through Tor, and if you still use it, then it's on you, right? I hope that answers your question. Anyone else? Okay, if there are no other questions, then thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned something.